Okay, so, um, like, picture this. It's 2004. The internet's it's basically a lawless frontier, right? And you've got this scrappy little website. Nobody's heard of them. They're called the Pirate Bay, right?
Huh.
And they told DreamWorks, the DreamWorks, to, and I'm quoting here, go sodomize themselves. I mean, you really can't make this stuff up.
It's true. It's like it's such a classic example of just the whole rebellious spirit of the early internet. You have this. It really is a Clash of the Titans kind of thing, like David and Goliath, right? Except instead of slingshots, it's ones and zeros, and it really did set the stage for all this digital rights stuff that we're still wrestling with today.
And to be fair to DreamWorks, they were trying to throw their weight around a little, right? They hit the Pirate Bay with a cease and desist, said they were violating copyright law.
Yeah.
The whole 9 yards.
Right. But here's the thing. Here's where it gets kind of interesting. DreamWorks, they tried to use the DMCA, which, for anyone who doesn't know, it's a U.S. law, to go after the Pirate Bay, which at the time was operating entirely out of Sweden.
Ah, okay.
So it was like they thought their jurisdiction, like the American law, just magically applied to like the entire internet, regardless of, where things were actually happening.
So a little bit of a misfire on DreamWorks' part.
Yeah, just a tad. Like they brought a knife to a gunfight, kind of.
Okay.
Or like they were playing checkers and the Pirate Bay was playing like 4D chess or something.
Right.
And the Pirate Bay, oh man, in their typical like no holds barred style, they called them out on it hard. Yeah. Their response was legendary. Basically, told them to go do something that's anatomically impossible. But the bigger point was they were saying, hey, we're not breaking any Swedish laws here, and it wasn't just about like piracy, right? It was about sticking it to the man, about like challenging authority, pushing boundaries, and that really resonated with people back then.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was like a rallying cry for like a whole generation of, early internet users. But you're right. This wasn't just some isolated thing, this little exchange. It actually brought up a much bigger issue.
Yeah.
How do you even enforce laws in a space that's like by its very nature designed to ignore borders?
Exactly. And, the Pirate Bay, at least in the beginning, they were working within like the rules as they stood in Sweden, right? But what they were doing, it had like these ripple effects all over the world. They were making content like movies, music, whatever, available to anyone, anywhere who had an internet connection. And that's where things got really, really complicated.
Because suddenly you've got like this tension, right, between these national laws and the global nature of the internet itself.
Exactly. And honestly, it's a tension that we still haven't really figured out even now. The internet just doesn't care about borders. But, legal systems, they very much do. And it creates this whole gray area that's made it like incredibly difficult to actually enforce anything consistently.
And DreamWorks, like, well, they're a massive company, right? Like tons of resources.
Oh, yeah.
They weren't just going to let this go.
No, of course not. They had like whole armies of lawyers, lobbyists, you name it. And they could apply pressure at the governmental level in a way that like a small website just couldn't. Plus, don't forget about the influence of like those big industry groups, the MPAA, the RIA, those guys. They all had skin in the game. They were all like super invested in figuring out how to protect copyright in this new digital landscape.
So what happened? Did Sweden just like cave under the pressure?
Well, it's a little more complicated than that. But yeah, international pressure definitely played a role. Sweden did end up, they amended their copyright laws, made it much clearer that like even if you weren't directly hosting the copyrighted material, if you were, facilitating the sharing of it, that could be considered a crime.
So even though the Pirate Bay wasn't like storing the files themselves,
right,
they were seen as like enabling it.
Exactly. They were providing the platform, like the map, right, that let people find and download these files. And in the eyes of the law, that made them, just as guilty.
And this is where it starts to get real for the Pirate Bay.
Yeah.
This isn't just like internet tough talk anymore.
Right. This whole thing, this little act of defiance, it snowballed. Like it turned into this huge legal battle with global consequences.
Yeah.
And it all culminated in the raid and shutdown of the Pirate Bay servers in 2009, and then the trial of the founders.
Wow. So what happened to them? Did they go to jail?
They did.
So even though the Pirate Bay, like the actual website was shut down, it feels like, well, Like their whole ethos kind of lived on, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
Like the name is still out there,
Mm-hmm.
still like this big thing in the world well, the shadier parts of the internet, I guess.
Totally. The Pirate Bay, they became like synonymous with this whole idea of, not playing by the rules, of like fighting back against corporate greed. At least that's how a lot of people saw it. It's crazy how a website, like even one that got taken offline, could still have this much like cultural impact.
It's like there was this underlying frustration, right? This feeling, especially back then, that these companies, these big corporations, were trying to like take control of how we were allowed to enjoy things online.
Oh, absolutely. And that frustration, it didn't just go away when the original Pirate Bay disappeared. It's like they planted a seed, and even though they were gone, the seed, it took root. And it grew. Like now you see the name the Pirate Bay, but it's not like one thing anymore,
Yeah.
It's attached to all these different groups, some shadier than others. Some people will swear by it, right? Others are like, stay away, man. It's a recipe for getting a virus.
It's a gamble then,
Pretty much.
like walking into a casino. Might hit the jackpot.
Yeah.
Or, you might walk out with an empty hard drive and a computer full of malware.
Yeah.
It reminds me of like the really early days of file sharing before the Pirate Bay was even like a thing.
Yeah.
I remember LimeWire.
Yeah.
LimeWire. And it was like every time you downloaded a song, it was like, were you going to get the actual track or were you going to get like the digital equivalent of the plague?
Right. It was like digital Russian roulette. Like, oh man, those were the days though, weren't they? Dial-up modems, waiting like 3 hours for a single song to download.
And you wouldn't know if it was any good until it was done. And it was like 99% of the time it was garbage.
Exactly.
But it's like back then the internet was like, I mean, it really was the Wild West, wasn't it? Just this completely unknown territory.
Uh-huh.
And like we were all just making it up as we went along.
Totally.
And, the Pirate Bay, they kind of came out of that whole chaotic time, didn't they? Like they gave people this map, right, to this like crazy digital wilderness. But like we were saying before, that map, it didn't always lead to the most, let's say, legal or ethical places.
Exactly. It was this weird mix of, it had this kind of Robin Hood thing going on, but also they were like, breaking the law.
Right.
But as that whole legal battle with the Pirate Bay was going on, the piracy scene itself, it was changing too. We saw like these other big sites come and go. RARBG, Kick-Ass Torrents, all these different players all trying to like push the envelope a little further, stay one step ahead of, the authorities, and the law was always trying to catch up.
It was like a game of whack-a-mole, wasn't it?
Totally.
One site gets shut down, bam, another one pops up in its place.
And it shows you how much people wanted this stuff, this free and open access to movies, to music, to whatever. But, like I was saying, the authorities, they were getting smarter too. They started going after the underlying infrastructure, the hosting providers, the domain registrars, the companies that like these websites relied on to actually exist.
So it became a tech arms race then.
Kind of, yeah. And as the risks got higher, the tools, the techniques that people used to get around those risks, they got more sophisticated too. VPNs. So, encrypting your traffic, hiding your location, that became huge. And then there were private trackers.
Okay.
Way more exclusive, strict rules, invitation only,
So, like, break it down for me. How did these, like, private trackers, how do they even work? It sounds kind of secretive.
It is, a little bit, yeah. It's like, imagine like a speakeasy, right? During Prohibition. You need to know the password to get in. That's kind of what it's like. It's a closed network. Usually you need an invite from someone who's already a member. Way stricter rules than those public sites. And it makes it a lot harder for the authorities to track what's going on because it's all like a hush-hush, And because they're all about sharing, about the community, the quality of the torrents, it tends to be way better. And the downloads are faster too.
So they're catering to like a much smaller, much more dedicated, I guess, tech-savvy audience.
Exactly. Often it's like communities of people who are like super passionate about a certain type of content, movies, TV, music, even software sometimes. And they see it as a way to preserve, to share stuff that might not be easy to find through, the regular channels, or they just don't want to deal with the restrictions or the cost of streaming services.
So it's like the Wild West, it's still there, but it's like gone underground, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's like moved into like these hidden tunnels, these digital underground bunkers. And a big part of that is, well, it's the rise of the streaming services, right?
Right.
At first it seemed like Netflix, Spotify, all of those, they were going to like solve everything.
Yeah.
You know, like, oh, there's this huge library of stuff, relatively cheap, it's all legal.
Yeah, it felt like the sheriff had finally ridden into town.
Right.
Like, okay, the Wild West is over.
Exactly. But, you know, there are always going to be those folks, those like hardcore types who just, they want to do things their own way.
The outlaws.
Exactly. They don't like being fenced in, don't like being told what they can and can't watch or listen to. And it wasn't just like, you know, the diehard pirates either. It was normal people too. People who felt like, for whatever reason, those streaming services, they weren't cutting it.
So what were those reasons then?
Right.
Like, why even bother with piracy when you've got Netflix, Spotify, all that stuff at your fingertips?
Well, one big thing was this whole fragmentation thing. The more streaming services popped up, the more spread out everything got. Like, you wanted to watch everything. Well, now you needed 5 different subscriptions. And that gets expensive fast.
Oh, yeah. Subscription fatigue is real.
Yeah.
I love movies. I love music. But there's only so much I can justify spending every month. You know?
Exactly. And that's where, you know, that's where the piracy thing comes back in. Because why pay for 5 different things when you could theoretically get it all for free? Even if it's, you know, a little legally questionable.
And we are definitely not, like, endorsing piracy or anything here.
No, of course not.
Support the artists.
Absolutely.
Obey the law, all that good stuff. But it's interesting, right? Because it shows how it's not as simple as just right and wrong.
Yeah.
You know, there's like all these different reasons why people do this. The cost, convenience, and yeah, maybe even a little bit of like, hey, stick it to the man, still lingering in there.
Totally. It's way more nuanced than people give it credit for. And honestly, if we want to actually like solve this whole thing, we got to understand those reasons. Got to figure out a way to balance, you know, protecting the people who create this stuff with making sure it's actually accessible, that people can afford it, you know?
So where do we even go from here then?
Yeah.
Is there an answer? Is piracy just always going to be this like this cat and mouse game? Or is there a way to like actually make it go away?
That's the $1 million question. And honestly, I don't know if there is a simple answer. Like, as technology gets better, piracy gets better. And so do the ways to stop it. It's like this constant arms race. We're already seeing that now, even with like streaming specific piracy apps, sites that get around like all the normal ways we try to protect content.
So the battle rages on. And it sounds like it's one we're going to have to fight on like on every front. Technically, legally, even just like as a society.
Exactly. And maybe the most important thing, honestly, is that we keep the conversation going, keep talking about this stuff, because it's complicated. And the answers aren't obvious.
It's about more than just like catching the bad guys.
Yeah.
It's about figuring out a way for everyone to win. The creators, the companies, and yeah, the people who just want to enjoy a good movie or song.
I like that.
And on that note, I think we'll leave it there for today. It's been quite the deep dive into the world of piracy. But hey, kind of like the internet itself, the conversation never really ends, does it?
Nope.
Until next time, everybody, stay curious.